Good evening. Welcome to the Adventurers Club Thursday night broadcast. Thank you for tuning in. Pardon some of our technical difficulties we occasionally run into. It makes life interesting on our end. We appreciate you staying with us. If you are interested and you find tonight's program interesting, please follow our YouTube channel, subscribe to it, and you'll get notifications about new programs coming up. We do them every week here. We have some pretty interesting people that come on, and you won't want to miss out on those. We have programs running all year, every Thursday night. Also, you can find the Los Angeles Adventurers Club on Spotify and almost all the other podcast distributors, so you can take us on the road, listen to us on the way to work and home, anytime you're working in the yard. Learn something new, hear some interesting stories from people who've been out there and done interesting things. So tonight we have with us Bryan Kresie, member 1186. Really appreciate you joining us, Bryan.
It's great to be here.
So you did a program for us last year on bagging peaks, which was an interesting program. Go back and find that one. Tonight we're going to talk about treasure hunting and archaeology, an interesting mix, but interwoven heavily. So if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, Bryan, just kind of some of your background leading up to this.
Okay, yeah, I'm from northern Utah, and I grew up there, junior high, high school, graduated from Utah State with a degree in history and a minor in anthropology, which was a lot of fun. And when I started getting into, I always liked history, and so growing up in Utah, when you grow up country, you have the opportunity to do a lot of cool things. And my parents, especially my dad and my grandfather, were really into going out and looking for artifacts. And so I kind of started, when I was a kid, my grandfather had a metal detector. And they're not like the fancy ones you have now. It's like pretty old school, pretty basic. We're talking the early 70s. But he would go out and metal detect, and I'd go with him. And you'd probably find like 20 nails and pull tabs before you'd find anything cool. But you know, like when you're 5 and 6, 7, and you dig up a coin, it's like, oh my gosh, I just found treasure. This is amazing. Oh my God, I want to do this again. It's almost like this little hit.
The reward system.
Yeah, it was cool. And like, even when the metal detector would ding, you didn't know what was there. So it was like the process of digging stuff up is just amazing. And so that's what kind of really got me into treasure hunting and metal detecting at an early age, which then bled into like doing archaeology and more like cultural resource management and historic preservation.
Okay. So this has kind of always been with you, part of what you do?
Oh, yeah.
You've been kind of in and out of it, or it's been a sideline all along?
Well, my grandfather, he used to just like to go for hikes, and we would just go anywhere. And when I was younger, my parents moved around quite a bit. They worked for Harmon's, like Kentucky Fried Chicken, H-Saw Fish and Chips. And then my grandfather would come and visit, him and my grandmother would. And he'd bring his metal detector. And there were a lot more open spaces back then. Old houses to go through, like even in the center of town, or you could go out into more rural areas and hike. And there's always things to go through, things to find. And then when we moved back to Utah, my father was really into classic cars up in Logan. And so was his brother, my uncle.
Logan.
Oh, you know Logan? Yeah.
Bluebird Cafe?
Oh my God, dude. How do you know the Bluebird?
It was, we drove through there on a family trip. We stopped in the Bluebird, had lunch. It sticks in my mind because somewhere outside of Logan, we had a car flip over on the freeway in front of, we were the only two cars out there. And they rolled over and down in, and it was quite the impression on a young person.
Well, it's funny that you said Bluebird because my grandma Amy worked there for 25 years.
Oh, well.
Yeah,
We might have met her not knowing it.
Yeah, she worked there forever. And we used to go in there and eat as when I was a kid. But yeah, the Bluebird that's a fixture in Cache Valley.
Yeah.
So it's cool that you mentioned that. So we'll give a shout out to the Bluebird. If you find yourself up in northern Utah, you want to check it
Yeah,
out.
definitely stop in. Very worthwhile.
But my dad and his brother, they were into classic cars. And there's a car show up there now called Logan's Run.
Ah, okay.
And, but this was back in the day in the 70s when they first started the club. And we would hike through the fields looking for car parts to restore cars. And my dad was pretty extreme with it. Like, they would go everywhere. And again, back in the day, you go out in the country, there were just old cars everywhere. People, their truck would die or their car would die, they just leave it out in their back 50, back 40. Yeah. And so when these cars started getting more valuable and people were trying to restore them, they would go looking for parts.
Like little parts stores parked in the fields.
Yeah, and so they would go out and look for stuff. And then in addition, they had a canal system, and then the rivers, and to stop erosion, they would take old cars and they would slam them in the side of the river.
Oh.
Yeah, so you could go through, and you'd, like these areas where there's heavy erosion, the farmer or the property owner would put these cars up on the banks. So you'd come to an area and there'd be like 5 or 6 cars slammed up against the river.
That's an interesting bit of recycling.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. But my dad was a little bigger than me, so I was little, so he would kind of use me as like a canary because I was lighter. And he's like, okay, go out. I need the F off this Ford that's on the hood, but the car's like in this precarious position, which now that I think about it was probably pretty dangerous, but they were young, so if they lost me, they could have more kids.
That car part was probably worth more than you anyway.
Yeah, they didn't have a lot invested in me at the time, so. But, he'd give me a little screwdriver or pry bar, and he'd pop the chrome off, or, whatever piece they were looking for. And I remember when we were going through one car, the seat was in the back. I want to say it was an old Chevy or something, but it had this, those old school hoods that came out almost like a torpedo looking thing. I remember I was in back, and I was able to get under the seat, and I found a Mercury dime. Like a 1947 or something. I was like, my God, this is a coin. Yeah. And so I showed it to my dad, and he's like, oh yeah, that's what happens when people's change falls out. So every time I would go with him, I would purposely pop the seats looking for change, and I built a pretty good coin collection as a kid.
So both your grandfather and your father didn't give you money, that you had to go find your own.
Yeah, I was on my own, so you had to do what you had to do. But as I got older and I could go out by myself, I'd go out with friends, and we would bike as far as we could. We'd stash the bikes, and then we would just go hiking and look for stuff. And, it used to drive my mom crazy because we'd leave at like 7 in the morning and not get home at 10 at night. And I know that sounds probably pretty crazy right now, but back in the day, it wasn't a big deal for your kid to be gone all day.
Yeah, and a little more country, a little more. I remember up in Central California when I was going to school, no one locked their cars.
No.
No one locked their front door.
No, you just did whatever. And so you would just get to go out, and it was like you were seriously like free ranging, and they didn't really care what happened with kids. And then I would just bring home stuff that I found, and then my mom would be like, oh God, you brought home more stuff. And my dad would be like, oh, what'd you get? And so he'd start kind of rooting through it.
Yeah.
And
any car parts in there?
yeah, that's what he did, because I would pop the emblems off the old cars if I could. And they were like, the way they're set on the hood is they put on the hood, and they would have like these tongs that went down to like connect them. So we get under and pop those and bring them up. And I think at one point I had like 27 hood ornaments from various cars. And then my uncle found out who restored cars, and then he started talking to his friends, and my 27
disappearing.
Yeah, that went to 0 really fast. But they would take me to either Bluebird or Glouser's, and I would get a dessert. So I'm like, okay, yeah, this is paying off for me. I can't complain. Yeah. So, but I would go pretty much every weekend I could and look for change. And then, over the course of a few years, I built a pretty sweet coin collection of like pennies, dimes, and nickels. If you found a quarter, it was awesome. Yeah. And that's where I found my first standing Liberty quarter they were made in like the 20s and stuff. So I was pretty happy with that. And I just got a taste for it. And then as you get older, you can do more things. So remember when I was talking about the cars being impacted on the river? I would get with my friend Mark, and we were friends in junior high, grade school. I've lost track of him. It's been like, I'm talking 40 years now. But we would get inner tubes. And we would just take the inner tubes down Logan River or the canals. And then if we came to something cool, we would like paddle over and then start going through it and rummage in it. And then that's when I found my first bottle. And it was one of those, like the square ones they had back in the day, like the medicine bottles and stuff.
Sure.
And then the soda bottles. We started finding bottles. And so that then got incorporated into what we were looking for, old coins, and we'd find old bottles. And then it was like a contest on who could find the coolest thing. Yeah. And I mean, 90% of the stuff we brought home was garbage. Like, oh, this is a really cool bottle. You get home and your dad's like, why did you bring home an old Lowenbrow bottle? What are you thinking? But at the time, you would get that rush, or then you would find something interesting. Yeah. And so I had boxes of bottles. And, then as I got older and could like figure out, oh, this is worth something, or this is interesting, or this is garbage, then I just kind of culled the herd. Yeah. And then the other thing we would do is we would hike through the irrigation ditches, and then you would find bottles there too. So I remember my favorite bottle I ever found was like an old Mountain Dew bottle from the 60s, which in 1970 or 1979, 1982, I was like, oh my God, it's like 12, 13 years old.
Yeah, that's really old.
Yeah, this is really cool. They don't make them like this anymore.
Yeah.
So it went down in my room, and then I started building a collection, and then the stuff that was more modern, we would just turn in. And you would get like the dime or the nickel or whatever the recycling value was. You'd take it to Albertsons or Smith's Food King, you cash it in, they give you money.
Sure.
So that was kind of cool. And then we expanded into collecting cans. And again, I think this was just a way for my parents to get us out of the house. But they would I remember my grandmother, she would take us out to some area, give us a garbage liner, and she'd drive a couple 100 feet, and she'd be like, okay, see what cans you find. And so we would find cans, and then we would find bottles, and collect the aluminum, and then we keep the bottles. And it was like when you're 12, 11, 10, it's like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. Yeah. And that's kind of how I got started in relic hunting before I got my first metal detector.
Yeah, I used to collect bottles also. And yeah, we used to go out and dig in old dumps and go to old mining towns and find where the outhouse used to be.
Yeah, privy diving.
Yeah. You dig that up and find strange things down in the bottom.
Yeah, well, you would, because back in the day, the outhouse, and if I have any, for my students who are watching this is back before you had indoor plumbing. You would just about a few, like in back of the house, you would dig a big hole, and that's where people use the bathroom, but that's also where they'd throw trash, and then when it filled up, they would just move the outhouse.
And sometimes things would fall out of people's pockets, and they weren't going to go retrieve it.
And yeah, you're like, yeah, do I really want that penny that much? No.
And the best bottles went down there, so the wives wouldn't find it.
Yeah, the whiskey bottles. But that's how it got started. But we used to, every summer we would hit the river, and then we would just find stuff. Like, you'd find stuff like, we found a fishing pole one year, a lot of bottles, a lot of cans, and then just like, again, the car parts. And those always had as soon as I found those, my father knew somebody who was gonna want it. And again, I got free food out of it, so, it worked out okay. And then one year for Christmas, I got my first metal detector. And it's all White's Electronics.
So now you're self-sufficient.
Yeah, so now I can expand, and then through junior high, high school, those weekends we'd go out and look at old houses, or just go out and, like, there was a place called the Sugar Factory in Logan, they tore it down. But you would go out and metal detect, and you'd find all sorts of stuff. we'd find a lot of nails, you know, a lot of junk, but then you would sort it out like, oh, well, this is copper. Copper has a value in and of itself. Then you start looking at the nails. Oh, this is a square-headed nail, so it's older.
Got some history. And
And it's very blue-collar treasure hunting. It wasn't like super fancy. It was more like relic hunting.
Yeah.
And then, but finding the relics, the coins became secondary.
So I'm sorry, I'm going to back you up.
Oh, go ahead.
Explain the square nails for those who might not know what.
They're just older nails. Before they standardized nails, they had these old square hand-forged nails that they would use. And they call Cache Valley, C-A-C-H-E, like in cache, and what the history behind that area was that the mountain men used to go and get their pelts. They'd like collect pelts, and they would cache them in Cache Valley. They would stash them there, and then at the end of the year, they would have these mountain men rendezvous, and they would trade for the stuff they needed for another year. And then when the early Mormon settlers came from back east and migrated west, the area got settled. And so Utah, like a lot of places in the West, have a lot of old ghost towns. And then some of them were like old Mormon settlements, mining settlements, things like that. And, you know, and then some communities prospered, some not so much. So there's actually an old book on ghost towns called Some Dreams Die, and it just records all the ghost towns and migration in areas like Utah.
Interesting. Yeah, my family spent a lot of time running around ghost towns when we were little. That was our big outing, and that was a ton of fun.
Yeah, well, no, it is, because it's like you just, like when you're younger, and older people, everybody likes it. Everybody likes going through old things. Everybody likes having these adventures where they get to see certain things. And so I don't know, there's something that I feel like is in the human spirit of connecting with the past in a certain way. And it can either be like, obviously through memories, also through story, which is kind of what the club's all about, is stories, or through like touching something that's tangible or physical. But like, my first real vivid memory of doing that was I was in junior high and I took a different way to school and I'd cut through a field. And this is back when you would like hold out the barbed wire and you would cut through that one.
Carefully.
Or you'd push it down and step over it, and if you weren't careful, you went from baritone to soprano real fast if it popped back up. But I was walking and I saw this coin and I picked it up. It was just like kind of buried, but I just saw the rim, because I always walk with my head down because I might see something. And it was this big coin. I'm like, oh my God, what is this? And it was a 1950 British penny, or 1915 British penny.
Now that's an odd thing to find in the middle of a field in Utah.
Yeah, and that was the thing. It was like, well, how did this coin get here? Like, this coin has no business being out in this field, yet here it is.
I mean, you'd think like in the 1800s maybe but.
Yeah, I mean, like definitely a 1893 Morgan silver dollar with the Oregon Mint mark or whatever. That would have been like awesome, but but I was still pretty happy with the penny. But it was just like, how did this penny that was minted in England at that point, like 70 years ago or 80 years ago, how did that get here? And so that kind of got me thinking on a lot of like, well, it made me think, oh gosh, what else is out here? But what's the story on how it got here? And I was just like, God, if this coin could talk, it would tell me some cool stories. How many pockets did it take to get from London to northern Utah?
Yeah, is that guy buried around here?
Yeah, maybe. You never know. But so at that point, when I hit junior high, I started doing a lot of research. And I was, as a middle school teacher, I probably shouldn't say this, but I was a pretty lazy student. And so if something interested me, I would really get into it. But if not, and 90% of school did not interest me at all. But I started reading these treasure hunting books, Carl von Mueller's books on treasure hunting. They're like classics. The first books were being put out by Charles Garrett, Garrett Metal Detectors. And I just started doing research on coins, research on bottles, research on metal detecting, on what you could find and where you could find it. And like Utah didn't have the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, like the back east treasure hunters get to look for, but we had a lot of homesteading stuff. And so then, you know, up the game, start finding where stuff is, start talking to people, get permission to search the property most of the time. I mean, it was pretty shooting from the hip at that point, but we found a lot of stuff.
Did you run across Native American?
When I was, at this point, I wasn't really looking at indigenous artifacts. I knew people who collected it, but my focus was really on historical artifacts.
Sure.
And so I was always looking for stuff that had been like settler stuff. And so when I got my metal detector, I actually learned I learned one lesson the hard way with relic hunting, because you have the headphones, and because you want to hear everything, so you're detecting. And I was detecting this old farmhouse, and I got this really loud sound, and it just beat the bricks off my ears. And so I dug, and it was like down about this deep, I found an old axe head that had been hand forged.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, whoa, this is cool.
That's a nice piece.
Yeah, that was a nice piece. And so I'm like, oh yeah, this is gonna be great. Detecting later, and then I found a shovel head that was like more from the modern era. So I was like, not everything's good. But, and you dig up a lot of trash, but I mean, that's why it's called relic hunting and not relic finding.
Sure.
It's kind of like the old joke, it's why it's called fishing and not catching. So.
Yeah, there's a lot of sorting at the end of it all.
Yeah, but it was just great. And then I got to up my game with inner tubing and looking for relics, because I was a little bigger. And so take the metal detector and we'd hit the sides, because people would go fishing in some of these areas because they had fish, and then they would lose stuff. So there was one summer we dug a lot of sinkers.
So you were just floating downriver and stopping periodically at
Yeah, if something looked
likely
cool.
spots?
Yeah, if I would fish there, I would stop and I would look for stuff. And then you'd find like beer bottles, a couple of whiskey bottles. This is back when they had the old half pints and stuff.
Yeah.
So we would find stuff. And then this part was probably not the best idea, but even in town, which you can tell I grew up in the country, if you call it in town, the canals would run under the streets, and you'd have the bridge where the road went over. And so we would go under the road, and there might sometimes be like this much clearance if you're on the inner tube.
Sure.
And then we would stop, and that was a little more dicey.
So disclaimer to the kids watching at home.
Yeah, don't do this. Don't do this at home, guys. It's not safe. You shouldn't do this.
See how he turned out.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to. This could be you. But in those areas, we found a lot of stuff. But this was before magnet fishing, which is now super popular.
What is?
Oh, magnet fishing is now what guys do is they'll get a big magnet. You can get them off Amazon.
Oh, okay.
They rope it up and they just
Drag it.
throw and dredge.
Okay.
And you'll find anything that's magnetic. So it won't find coins, because coins aren't magnetic, and you won't find aluminum or copper or brass. But
Find some engine blocks and.
yeah, you find a lot of stuff like that. But yeah, every summer, Mark and I found a lot of stuff. And then as it progressed and we got older, we knew what cars to look for, which would have the best stuff. So you could almost do a profile. So for seat popping, station wagons, older station wagons were the best.
Because they had
Kids.
a lot of kids in them.
And kids would lose stuff. And so even the most modern ones were fun, because you would pop, and and not only coins, you would find old baseball cards, old football cards, toys. One year I found, like, this is going to date me, but the original Star Wars movies, we found 5 Star Wars action figures one summer going through cars. And
Obviously a period where.
yeah, where kids were losing their stuff. And it was cool to find them, but sadly those 5 were all the same action figure. Each time it was the Luke Skywalker and the X-Wing pilot
the
outfit.
common one.
Yeah, and you're just like, Well, and it's the one you could play with the least, because, I mean, how long did he, what can you really do with 5 Luke Skywalkers that are X-Wing pilots? But they're still at my house. I still got them. But it was all the time. And then the other common finds were silverware. And we found a lot of silverware that was like either real silver, but more often was plate silver.
Sure.
And again, like, you know, knife, fork, spoon, we mainly found spoons.
So was this in settled areas or just kind of
Rural,
random?
mainly rural areas, like around houses we would find the silverware.
Okay.
But they were like mainly spoons, because kids would go out and they would dig and they would lose
Okay.
mom's spoon.
I was going to say, it seems an odd thing to lose a lot of silverware, but that makes sense. And
Yeah, because, well, the kids would go out and they'd dig and play and they'd forget it, and then I'd come along and I'd find it.
it's funny, I had when I was little, my grandparents used to babysit me, and I kind of bounced between the two grandparents at various times because my mom worked. And I remember one time she said, "Come out and help me work in the garden," right? Because she loved gardening, had roses and all kinds of stuff. So I was digging in there, and I dug up a Mercury coin, and I think it was like 1916 or something.
Like a Mercury dime?
Mercury dime, yeah. And it was, seems like it was that. I may have the date wrong, but it was the oldest coin I'd ever seen, you know, in person. And I suspect that she planted it there because by the end of the day, her entire garden bed was dug up, and all she had to do was come out
And just watch you dig.
Yeah.
So you kind of got Tom Sawyered for a dime. But what was the adrenaline rush like when you found a
it was
dime?
amazing. It was like you said, it's like finding a piece of history. You know, like, how did this get here? It
Yeah,
wasn't
you're like,
that
"Oh
old of
my
a
God."
house. You know, it was, the house was probably built in the, I'm guessing 50s,
Yeah,
40s maybe.
but you could also guess what house was there before, or was this the first house
Yeah.
built?
Yeah.
And then a lot of times, this is one of the things I found from research, was when they would build a house, they would take the fill off if the soil was good, and they'll go sell the soil, and then you get the crummy soil underneath, but that's where the oldest stuff is.
Sure.
So it's like, how do you find old coins? You dig in old dirt.
Yeah.
And so you can find a lot of stuff, especially on, like, if they were doing any construction, those are also good times to go metal detecting. And then my mom's cousin, Clinton, he was big into metal detecting and treasure hunting, and he was always finding stuff. And so the stories he would tell, because he would go out and he was almost like full-time. And his coin collection was just amazing. But, you know, and that's kind of the thing with treasure hunting is, when you think of treasure hunting, you think of guys like Mel Fisher, you know, who go out and find like the Spanish galleon and stuff. But a lot of treasure hunting or relic hunting is just guys who have a real passion for history or collecting or whatever, just going out and doing stuff. And they'll push themselves just as hard as the professional treasure hunters, just on a much lower scale. Which is cool because it also makes it more approachable if you want to do it.
Sure.
And you just got to get really exotic and creative now as we've moved forward in time on what you can find and what you're looking for. But some of the other relics we found that were cool is, remember the old straight edge razors?
Oh, yeah.
I found one of those. A lot of gun parts. Sadly, I
Just
never
parts.
found. Yeah, I never found a full gun. But one cool thing I did find, and I think it was somebody's mistake, is there was brass casings. I found this like this almost like cast iron. It's a cast iron pail. It's about like this big. Here, I'll put my hand out like that. And it had melted lead on the side, but there were like 7 shell casings in with it.
Oh.
So I don't know if this guy was trying to recast and boogered it and got mad and was like, that's.
Yeah.
But
Or tipped his empty casings into
Yeah.
the lead pot.
But it was cool because, again, it tells a story of what somebody was doing. And we found that in some, like, it wasn't a full building. It was just like the outlines of the ruins where that kind of came up this way. It was brick. And we found that. And then we found just a lot of regular old shell casings, too. And that's another thing, especially if people hunt, you'll dig up a lot of brass.
Yeah.
So, but it was great. And the older you get, the more exotic you can become, because then you have a car, and if you're doing your research, you'll find places. So, yeah, it was a lot of fun. I wish I could go back and do it all over again.
Yeah, I've always wanted to try metal detecting. I've never done it, but it looks like fun. So,
Yeah.
if there are any metal detector companies out there who want to do a program, and here's your opportunity. Get in touch.
Actually, I remember Roy Roush.
Yes.
So when I first came to the club, Roy was the first speaker I ever heard talk. And I was super pumped up because, excuse me, because Roy was, he's a former Marine. And he, Guadalcanal, Saipan, Tarawa. So I'm like, this is going to be an amazing talk. So Roy's talking about, the stuff he did during World War II and then what he did after World War II, but he'd become a professional treasure hunter. And I didn't realize it until he said it, but he had been an editor for like several treasure hunting magazines.
Oh.
And I'm like,
I didn't know that.
I used to read his stuff when I was a kid, because I couldn't really afford the treasure hunting magazines, but I would go to the store and just like read them. And,
Flip through them.
Yeah, no one's going to say anything because you're like 15, 14. What are they going to say? You can't read the magazine?
Yeah.
Well, I guess I could have, but... And I'd actually saved up a lot of money to buy a couple of the books that he had printed on the Knights of the Golden Circle treasures.
Yes.
And then we started looking for regular treasure. And, so you would... Every community has stories on, there was this outlaw and they robbed a stagecoach. They always start the same way. There's a stagecoach. These guys robbed the stagecoach. The treasure they found, the gold, the coins, whatever, it's too heavy, so they had to stash it and hide from the posse. Then they all got killed. Treasure wasn't found. But we went out and spent a couple days at City of Rocks looking for treasure, and we didn't find anything.
Yeah.
But
Sometimes wonder how many of those Wells Fargo agents made the story up.
yeah. Well, a lot of them, it's funny because they do all start the same way, and then you can research them and stuff, but if all that treasure would have been lost, being a stagecoach robber probably wasn't a very good career.
Yeah.
And then with Utah, they have all the Butch Cassidy stories. I think every community has its own Butch Cassidy story. Sure. So, but yeah, that was a lot of cool stuff. And then when I started university, that's when I was like, I really want to do archaeology. Because I thought, archaeology, treasure hunting, it's the same thing. You get to be a treasure hunter and you get paid for it.
Allegedly.
Allegedly, yeah. And then you find out that archaeology and treasure hunting are two very different things. But the people who do it still have the same mindset. They want to find something cool. It's just what they're going to do with that afterwards. So, but it was cool. It was a lot of fun. And I just can't tell you how much fun it is going out and doing that stuff. And so, yeah, I would go do it again. Still do it when I got the chance.
So you went to university. When you came out, you didn't lose your feel.
No. Well, I also wanted to travel.
Yeah.
And so when I was at university, I took time off and I went to Taiwan and taught English. And then I came back, finished school, and my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, we went to Korea when we graduated from university. And we were there for about 7-8 months. We did a teaching contract. Then we came back and we got married, but I applied for a job doing cultural resource management through Utah State University.
Okay.
And they were surveying a burn site up in Idaho. And so it was just one contract. They had to do seed replanting or area replanting. So what had happened was you'll have these big fires that come through and they just scorch everything. And so the BLM, and a lot of property in the West is owned by the BLM, Bureau of Land Management. Well, they have to reseed because they don't want the erosion from the wind and stuff. It becomes a big problem.
Giant dust storms and soil disappear.
But before they do the reseeding, they do surveys. And so Utah State University got a contract through, and it was Dr. Fawcett who was in charge of it. And so we spent a season doing archaeological surveys. No digs, it was all just straight eyeball archaeology.
So you just walk along in a line, or?
That was exactly what we did. So the fires would hit and you would have this desert pavement, and it's almost like area where you usually have scrub that's up kind of high. I think we lost our lights.
I think we lost.
That's okay. I probably look better in the dark anyway. Where you would have this scrub, you could go, it had all been burnt down, and so you would just take 5, 6, 10 field technicians. They'd line up about 15, 20 feet from each other,
Okay.
and you would just walk transects all day. And so you would have your clipboard, you would have your papers to fill out if you found something, and you just literally walked the length of the burn field looking for stuff.
So you work to a grid and kind of locate it on the grid?
And you locate it on the grid. This is before we had phones and
I was
GPS.
going to say, before
Yeah.
you had GPS.
We didn't have phones and GPS, but you would look. And so what you would do is you would look down, and then this is where I first started really getting involved with indigenous artifacts. So you would walk, and then it's like, oh, well, here's a piece of rock. Oh, well, oh, there's another one. And you would look for what were called lithic scatters.
Okay.
And it was just wood that had, or rock that had flaked from working the
Oh, the tool.
working the
Stone
tool.
tools.
And then when you start looking, you'd find more. If you find 5 scatters at the time, that was considered a site.
Now, would scatters be 5 individual flake pieces or 5 groups of?
5 individual flake pieces.
Okay.
And then you would, and then, because usually if you found that, you would find a biface. And a biface is basically just a rock that had been worked on both sides. And usually what had happened is whoever was making it made a mistake and is like, okay, this isn't going to work, so they throw it down.
Yeah.
And then they'd start again. And when we would find those, we would put up flags, so when the guys came on the tractors, they would go around those areas. So we found a lot of smaller sites. And then, of course, we also would find projectile points.
Sure.
But then we'd also find, like, historic stuff. And that was also, the rule of the time was anything 50 years or older was covered under, it was considered an artifact or a site.
Okay.
And so this was 1996. So going back, anything prior to 1946 was considered of historical significance.
Okay.
So we found a lot of indigenous artifacts. The one thing that we didn't find a lot of was pottery shards. I think that entire summer we found 1 pottery shard. And everything else was worked rock or projectile points. But then we also found a lot of historic artifacts. And again, it was anything you found, you just recorded the site and you'd put up the flags.
So to your knowledge, would other archaeology groups come back later and work those, or was it?
The lithic sites, I don't think they would, but what it did was, so think of it this way, so you got a whole map of an area. It's not feasible or economically possible to survey that whole area. Just the logistics of doing it would be impossible, combined with the vegetation and everything. But when these fires would come through and you were able to do the surveys quick, you would be able to set these sites up. And then so like, here's your big map. You got to burn through here. And then you would start charting where you would find these scatters or these artifacts. And so it kind of paints this picture of what life was like or what people were doing
The
back then.
populations were
And what they worked.
Okay.
And where I was, ignimbrite was the rock that was used the most. And that's like basically ash. Volcanoes would shoot up ash, it would cool. And so those were the rocks we found. Or the
So is that a
artifacts.
little? It's not like obsidian.
It's kind of similar, but not the same.
Okay.
And so we found a lot of ignimbrite stuff.
Okay.
And usually it was brown. It was kind of a brown reddish color. I actually, not artifact ignimbrite, but I picked up a few pieces while I was out there because it's kind of shiny and cool.
Okay.
So we found a lot of that stuff, but then we also would find a lot of historic stuff. And you always hear about cowboys and, you know, how rugged they were and stuff. Well, we found a lot of sites for not cowboys, but sheep herders.
Sure.
And so you could identify those by bottles.
Not quite as exciting. But
Yeah, it doesn't sound as cool. Well, it's like the earlier cowboys, before they were moving cattle all the time, they were moving pigs. So the earlier cowboys were pig boys moving pigs from point A to point B. Still not as cool.
okay. In case anyone's wondering, we had a light burnout, so thank you to our crew for trying to readjust things around that.
Yeah, Andy's Johnny on the spot trying to fix things. He's doing a good job. But what we found there that I was really surprised about and didn't know they existed were solder dot cans.
Oh, okay.
So back in the day, before you used your can opener to open things up, they would just take the can and put stuff in it, and they would solder the top. And it's just got a dot on it. And so those were prior to 1946. So we would record all these like sheep herder campsites too. And then if we found old shells from weapons and stuff, we recorded all that. And then at the end of that summer, I worked in the lab in January, February, like just recording everything in the computer. So then it goes in, again into this big database. But the thing that was interesting is we didn't collect a lot of artifacts. Most everything we found, we left. And so, like, I know there's this image of like, oh, you know, you're Indiana Jones, you're picking up all the artifacts and
Great
stuff.
prize.
Yeah, we just left it there. Unless it was something that was like really unique or interesting. And so the idea is most museums like have storage areas that contain more stuff than the actual artifacts that are on display. And so
Sure.
State of Idaho doesn't want to curate a bunch of things they already got a million of, so they'll just leave it there and just get the data or the information. But one of the cooler things we did find, and it was funny because again, you're thinking Native American finds, you're thinking all this cool history. One of the things that everybody got the most excited for was one of the earliest Coke bottles ever made. The first iteration of Coca-Cola. And that one we found and we bagged up. And
those can be worth something.
those are
for the
worth
right
something. But that, and then we found an old, like, blown wine bottle that would probably dated from the 1880s. And so those two things we did collect. We collected the pot shard. Some of the really unique projectile points we collected, but most of it we just left. And my takeaway from all that was all these areas that you think are like untouched where nobody goes and stuff, everyone's been all over everything. Because like we'd be out in the middle of nowhere, 20 miles from the nearest town, and we'd find a motorcycle somebody had left. There was like this 1960s dirt bike that was just lying there. And you're like, this was expensive. Why is it just lying here? But then we also found this car from the, like, it was old enough that those spokes were wooden. And the car was, we couldn't really identify what it was. It was just the wheels there and just like a pile of metal. So, and we weren't even taking photographs at the time. Because again, this is before digital camera and no one's going to invest in it.
Burn a bunch of film on.
No. I know we did have a camera that we had, but we were not burning film. And I kind of asked why, and they're like, well, nobody wants to curate these photos after we take them. If we take the photo, then now we're responsible for curation. So it has to be something cool if we're going to waste that much space. So, but we found some cool stuff. But everywhere we found, I think the biggest thing we found was this site was as big as a football field. And it was on a ridge overlooking a river. And it started out as a native site, an indigenous site, because we just kept finding lithic scatters, lithic scatters, lithic scatters everywhere. And we're like, damn, this is a pretty big site. But then we hit a point where the indigenous stuff started blending in with historic stuff from the 20s. And then what we found was an old civilian, or 30s, and it was an old civilian conservation corps site.
Oh, interesting.
And so there were bottles, cans, just debris, just tons of stuff. An old camp stove that they used back in the day, which again we didn't collect.
Yeah.
And
It's amazing how much went on with the CCC.
oh yeah, they were everywhere.
People don't realize what kind of work programs and how much of our parks and public works were done that way.
Yeah, and this site was enormous. We actually found where they had built some structures temporarily. And then in another site we found, I don't know how the guy lived there, but it was a historic site. We found some old shells, like rifle shells, like from the 30s or whatever. And we started doing the survey, and we found these rocks that had been put up, and it must have been just like a temporary living arrangement. But what the guy had done is he built it up to about this high, and then it went around, and it was just big enough to crawl in and go to sleep and get out of the wind.
Oh, just a little cave.
Yeah.
On top of.
But there was enough stuff there that it was probably where he brought his sheep every year, and he was out there. But I mean, and those are the type of things that don't sound interesting for like when you're thinking Indiana Jones archaeology, but it really does tell a tale on how that area was used and what happened with it.
Yeah. Well, you learn little bits of history that you didn't even think about before.
Oh yeah, and I mean, I never, like going in, I didn't know that much about sheep herding or the influence it had in the American West, but it was everywhere.
Yeah. So you get out in these areas, you drive out in a car, or do you hike out and stay out in places? How did that?
Well, what we would do is, they have all these fire roads and back roads in all these areas. Mm-hmm. So we would we would take the back roads to where we could park, and then we would hike out to our transect area. Sometimes it was right off the road, sometimes we'd hike a few miles to get there, and then we would just survey all day until we would like work the map through. And we were camping the whole time. So we were living out in the field, which, God, it was a lot of fun. Because it was, I mean, it's one of those deals where like, you get up at like 5 a.m., you have breakfast, you go out, you do your hike for the day, you knock out the transects, then you come back. And we were near the Snake River. And so, at least for part of it, and then, you come back, you're dirty. You can go wash off in the river, get cleaned up, and then really we just kind of hung out and drank beer and told stories. And then the next day we'd get up and rinse and repeat. And then every 5 or 6 days we'd go to the nearest town and have something to eat.
So you're working, but you get to camp every night.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, at one point I was like, God, I'm really getting paid for this? Yeah. This is too easy.
It's not a bad thing.
Yeah, unfortunately it's not sustainable as a grown-up, but being a grown-up,
it's overrated.
It leaves a lot to be desired after a while. Unfortunately, you spend most of your life as a grown-up. That's what kids don't understand.
So do you run into any characters out there when you're out in these remote places?
Well, we had a couple of incidents. There was one where we were 2 survey groups. Mm-hmm. And we had like a little radio. We tried to keep track, but they were crummy radios. They didn't work. And so when we met up at the end of the day, our second crew was like super rattled. And what had happened was they were out in this area and they got shot at.
Oh.
Yeah, and they don't know.
Not something you want to.
Yeah, like seriously shot at where they were pinned and they were like taking cover going, oh my God, we're getting shot at. People are shooting at us.
Wow.
And then whoever had done it just left. And then these guys got up and they finished the survey. But they were pretty rattled, so they're like.
Pretty scary experience.
Yeah, but it taught you a valuable lesson. You should probably bring your own gun with you when you go out and do that stuff, because the only thing worse than having somebody shoot at you is not being able to shoot back. So that was one interesting incident. And then when we would go into some of these towns, you're going to end up at the bar. That's just how it works. Mm-hmm. And so then you would meet
because
some.
Because there's basically nothing else to do in the town. Right?
Yeah, well, I mean, some of these towns are so small that you're going to. Drinking's a coping mechanism, I'm sure. But these guys were so cool. And you'd go in and these old timers would talk to you and stuff, and they were really friendly. And a lot of these bars actually had their own museums where people had collected stuff. So You go into it, there's the bar, and you're getting your drinks, and they'd serve food, but there'd be a corner where they just have all these artifacts that they'd found. And you're like, oh, that's why we're not finding anything cool, but lithic scatters, because this has all been pot hunted.
Yeah.
And you're familiar with a pot hunt?
I was going to ask you, what is pot hunting?
Okay, pot hunting.
I'm gathering it's not what it sounds like.
No, it's not weed. Although I guess some guys were probably looking for that too. But what it is guys who go out and they illegally search for artifacts, indigenous artifacts.
Okay.
Blanding, Utah's famous for it. There's a doctor, a dentist out there who basically ran afoul with the feds. And if you run afoul with the feds back in the day, you're egregious. Mm-hmm. And so they would look for like Anasazi pots for collectors, and they're worth a lot of money.
Yeah.
Or they would just, indigenous pots just in general. And so it gets to the point some of these areas are so rural, guys that go out with backhoes and just dig.
Yeah. And
so you get the artifact, but all the information around it, because it's not found in context or with anything else, it just gets thrashed. Yeah. And so they do it, and then the collectors buy it. So the whole black market thing for buying antiquities that way is really sketchy.
Yeah. So this is public lands.
It's public land, it's sold by everybody.
Okay.
And so when a few people go out and do that stuff, they kind of do ruin it for everybody. And my takeaway from as far as indigenous artifacts are, if I see something like, I was just out with a friend last summer, and we came across an indigenous site that was fairly pristine, and there were like pot shards. And we just shot film and then left.
Yeah.
We didn't take anything. There were like turkey bones, a couple of kivas. And it's like, on one level, I get it. People like to collect things. But on another level, it's like, okay, if I pick something up, A, I'm taking something I probably shouldn't take as far as indigenous artifacts go. And B, what if someone else who comes along, they're not going to feel that adrenaline rush or thrill of seeing something as it was left.
Yeah, I know some people that go out into the deserts, like Mojave, extensively, and they've got indigenous settlement sites out there with rock markings and all kinds of evidence of things, but they're not telling anyone where they are.
No,
because they don't want people coming out and looting and damaging and doing all the stupid stuff that people tend to do sometimes when they know where to find it.
And again, I get it from a collector point of view, but from a bigger picture point of view, is it really worth it to just pick something up and you take it home and then it sits there and, okay, cool, you got a cool story to tell, but the artifact's really not worth anything.
Collecting dust on your
and then it's just collecting dust. And then no one else is really enjoying it either.
Yeah.
So so that was kind of my takeaway from doing that. Although the one thing that was interesting, and this is like one of the crazy characters we met, we were in this area in Idaho, and we kept finding like brass shells from a 30 caliber machine gun. And we didn't really know what to do with it. It wasn't really historic. And
these were spent shells.
Spent shells, yeah. That would have been cool. But they're spent shells, and then we would find the 3 ring things, because like you have a shell, and you have 2 that come this way and 1 that goes this way, and then it's belt fed. Well, we kept finding the belts, the little rings. So we actually started making a necklace of these 30 caliber machine gun shells. But we're like, where the hell did these come from? Because obviously no one's fought a war in Idaho with machine guns. And we thought, well, maybe the National Guard came out and trained or something. Who knows? So I was talking to a guy in this bar, and I'm not going to tell the name of the town. And this was actually during the OJ trial. Oh. And they were watching the trial on there.
in the bar watching that.
Yeah, so these guys are in the bar watching that, and I'm sitting here talking to this guy, and he's like, well, he did it. He's guilty. And I'm like, okay, I don't want to have this conversation. So I asked him about the shells. I'm like, hey, did the National Guard ever train out here? And he's like, no, why? What are you talking? And I'm just telling him about the shells I found. And he's like, oh, that was probably from Varna's boy. Oh. And I'm like, I don't know who Varna is, or her boy. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, her son, and I can't remember his name. Well, he was in World War II. And when he came back, he brought a 30 caliber machine gun with him. And I'm like, oh, cool, that's awesome. And he's like, yeah, and he used to go out and they'd mount on the back of the truck and he'd go out and shoot rabbits. And I'm like, oh.
Wow.
So, yeah, so homeboy's out there like slaying rabbits with a 30 caliber machine gun that was used to shoot.
How sporting.
Yeah. But I was like, oh, okay, good to know. But I mean, but then it was kind of interesting because it's like, wow, you could just bring a machine gun home after World War II? I thought they frowned on stuff like that, but evidently not.
Well, World War II was, I think even Vietnam War to a degree, but World War II was definitely less controlled.
Yeah.
Because it was such a massive influx of people coming back. And I met a guy whose father was in service and in World War II in the Pacific Islands, and he had built a bar in a barn, and oh my God, you would not believe the stuff he had.
The stuff they brought back.
Yeah.
Yeah, they brought back really cool stuff. As somebody like, so I was in Iraq and Afghanistan, we did not bring machine guns home.
Yeah.
Or bullets or anything else. Those are highly controlled now.
A little more tightly controlled.
Yeah, because if not, you would have guys setting up machine guns on the back of their truck shooting rabbits today. And society frowns on that. So, but that was one of the more interesting things we saw while we were out there. And I was like, God, I really like, but it also made me think, so in some decrepit barn in Idaho, there's a 30 caliber machine gun just rusting away. Oh. But it was pretty, but that was fun. And then we found, again, a lot of bottles, a lot of indigenous stuff. And it was just, it's a great experience for anyone who likes history. But the thing with archaeology is there's two types of archaeology. So there's the stuff that we see on TV, like Raiders of the Lost Ark, or like you'll watch Discovery Channel and they're out there doing the dig, or like the Lost City of the Monkey God. There's that type of archaeology. And that's the stuff that everybody's really familiar with. But the bulk of all archaeology is really done through cultural resource management. And so like the fire was one. If they're expanding a road, the federal government, they'll do an environmental impact study, which will have a CRM component to it.
So they survey the area that it's going to pass through.
Yeah, and a lot of my friends who were employed doing cultural resource management archaeology were doing it for oil companies. So the oil companies would come through and they would have to do an environmental impact study with a cultural resource management component. And where it gets really official is if you find human remains, because then everybody gets involved.
Other can of worms.
And on some sites, even when they're just doing archaeology, they'll have a representative of the tribe or the indigenous people in case they find something of cultural significance that needs to be like respected or honored according to that tradition.
Sure.
So that's pretty cool. But the majority of archaeology done in the United States is cultural resource management.
And that's come a long ways in probably the last century or even 50 years.
Yeah, the
as
last
far as
50 years.
protecting things like that,
But
being more sensitive to it.
It's funny what falls under it, because do you remember the old school pop tabs from those? Yeah, those are artifacts.
Scars on my feet from those.
Yeah, because like we used to pop them open. Yeah, that's why. And as a side note, when we did the canal stuff, that's when I learned to wear tennis shoes when I was in the canal, because I sliced up my foot on pop tops a few times. But those are now
kids. You have it better today.
It's a lot safer. But we used to pop them off and like drop them in, and we never choked to death, so whatever. But those are now considered artifacts because they hit that 50-year mark. So if you're an archaeologist out there, you got to at least make a note of it. So, because 50 years now would go back to anything prior to me being 5 years old or 3 years old, I guess now is an artifact. So,
so you're almost an artifact.
Yeah, a few more years, I might be worth something. So you never know. But just the amount of stuff that is out there that is just waiting to be discovered, and the amount of stuff that is out there that would tell us so much more about how the West was, how we expanded and how our communities that were there, the communities that didn't make it, the communities that did make it, can tell us why certain communities made it, why certain communities didn't make it. And the individuals who participated in all this, it's just amazing. And I think that's like the coolest part of archaeology. Like, I really like the cultural resource management component of archaeology because it's stuff that would otherwise be ignored. And again, it's funny to think of something like an oil company because they're putting in a pipeline, and some people don't like that. But the fact that they're paying out of the project for the cultural resource management component, and we're still learning something about the past, is something that is kind of positive.
Interesting.
So,
I hadn't really thought about that being part of these kinds of projects, but it makes a lot of sense.
yeah, anything on federal land will have a environmental impact study on it. They just don't go out and throw stuff up there anymore. It's really well regulated. And what I think is really important too is just the partnerships that they've tried to forge with indigenous groups to make sure that all stakeholders are respected and everybody's needs are met at least as much as they can be, I think is really, really a positive. But most of the kids who are thinking they're going to be Indiana Jones, you're doing surveys for pipelines.
Yep. So let's switch it up a little bit.
Okay.
I saw Afghanistan
Okay, so
written down on some notes.
this is where I got a little shady with my archaeology. So when I was stationed I was in Afghanistan with the Civil Affairs Unit 2011, 2012. And we were in what's called Maiwand Province. And for the historians out there, you know, the British in Maiwand, an army got waxed back in the day, back in the 1800s, I want to say 1860s. Well, the combat outpost we were at was co-located right next to an old British fort. And this is a legit old British fort made of mud. It's huge. The Afghan National Police would go into the fort and they would have graduations for their classes. They also would set up targets and they would do their target practice. We actually...
Inside the fort.
Inside the fort.
Well, it makes sense. It's surrounded.
Yeah, it's surrounded and it's like, it was huge. And it's still sitting there like, you know, 130 years, 140 years. But the thing that was cool was right by the fort, the land was all flat. This whole area is flat. And so there's this big mountain, A&P Hill, which was the only natural high ground in the area. And it was like 600 feet. But if you got to the top of A&P Hill, you had the high ground and you could survey everything for miles and miles and miles. It was just beautiful.
A good lookout spot.
And yeah, and it was a great lookout spot, which is why the American Army was so interested in it at the time. And this is all common knowledge right now. I'm not giving out any really cool super spy secrets. But if the American Army was interested in it, and it was called A&P Hill because the Afghan National Police probably used it at the time. But moving back forward, every army that had gone through there probably saw the tactical advantage of A&P Hill.
Sure.
And so my team leader, my officer in charge, he was put in charge with putting a road up for A&P Hill because you have those big MRAPs that the Army uses. And the road was super sketchy to get to the top of the hill. So we were doing a survey for the hill. And one of the soldiers I was talking to was telling me they kept finding pot shards, like tons of them. And so I talked to my boss and I'm like, hey, sir, let's go check this out. I want to go check out the pot shards. And he's like, yeah, okay, let's do it. Because my boss was like super cool. Like he was down for pretty much anything. And so I spent 3 days just taking photographs of all the pot shards that were up there. Because, you know, you're going to have stuff that's like new or fairly modern all the way back.
A lot of layers, I imagine.
And then what the Army does is they build these walls out of Hescos.
Oh, these are the soil or rock filled.
Yeah, so they're like basically
bags.
it's like a big garbage bag, that they take and they fill full of dirt, and then they have wire around them and they form walls. If you watch the movies or the news, you'll see them. Well, they can come in different sizes. Some are bigger than you, some they stack. And so I was up there, and you would just look into the HESCO, the top of the HESCO, and you'd have like 15, 20, 30 different pot shards, different stuff. I mean, it was just littered everywhere. And so I was talking to one of the soldiers, there was a sergeant up there, and I'm like, hey, you got a lot of shards, but have you seen anything, did anything big come out? And he's like, well, there was this lieutenant. And as soon as he said lieutenant, I was like, oh God, this is not gonna end well. So for anyone who doesn't know military stuff, the lowest rank on the enlisted side, guys who don't go to college, is private. And privates don't know much. They don't have a lot of experience in the military, but they always ask because they're afraid they're gonna get yelled at.
Yes.
On the other end are the officers, and the lowest rank, newest to the military, is lieutenants.
And they know everything.
And they know everything. Yeah, they're just the opposite. They don't ask for anything. So I guess this lieutenant, one of the soldiers, had found a container top to go on a jar, and it had a bird that had come out. Oh. And as soon as the lieutenant got his dirty little paws on it, he dropped it and shattered it. Oh. No photograph, no nothing. He's like, it's the only thing that we found up here that was in one piece, and the LT broke it. And I was just like, God, that sucks. And part of me, like the archaeologist in me, got kind of sad. I was like, oh, they've just dug up this site. Now everything's mixed in, old and new. And then more pragmatic me is like, you know what? 500 years when all this kind of melts down, some archaeologist is going to come, and the American Army's trash is just going to be on everybody else's trash.
Be part of the mound.
Yeah, it'll just be a mound, and it'll just be more of the story on what happened at this hill.
And probably nobody would have found it anyway if they hadn't dug it up.
Exactly. No one would have found it anyway. But it does lead into like something else, like, you know, armed conflict and how that impacts cultural remains throughout the world. Because like, you know, in Iraq, you know how the museum in Baghdad was looted.
Just ransacked.
And then a lot of those sites have been looted. Like when ISIS was in charge, they were going through and they were actively breaking stuff to sell on the black market to fund what they were trying to do as far as consolidate power.
And then Taliban blew up the Buddhas.
And the Taliban blew up the Buddhas.
War is not good for history.
No, it's really hard on it. I mean, it makes history, but it's really hard on the cultural remains. But the thing that I don't think people understand is, like, if you're buying like an artifact you think it's gonna look cool in your living room and you like it because it's old, I mean, you really are funding a criminal organization. Yeah. And in the case of the Taliban, you're probably funding a group that you don't like what they're gonna do. And it's going to have a negative result or a negative consequence.
Yeah, be careful where your money's going.
Yeah, so you're breaking stuff, you're destroying history, and you're funding some not so nice guys. So, but I mean, that's the way it's always been. But it is funny because I've talked to some really uptight archaeologists who just hate the whole idea of treasure hunting. But when they're out doing a dig and they find something,
they get it for that moment.
The stuffiest professor I ever had was just as excited as my grandfather was when he found a coin. So they would find something. Had one, and I'm not going to say his name, but they found a bow in Nevada on a site. And of course, the first thing he does is, look at this. And it's like, you got a PhD and you're just like a 12-year-old kid, man. It's like, oh, wow, this is awesome.
As it snaps in half, PhD.
Yeah, well, he knew what he was doing, but it is funny because, like, archaeologists, especially in the United States, archaeologists and treasure hunters and relic hunters, they kind of have a more adversarial relationship. And in other countries, if you're out looking for artifacts, because there are so many artifacts, they'll do one of two things. They'll either, if you report it, and the archaeologist can come and take the data or the information, they'll let you keep the artifact. Or what they'll do is, if it's something that's valuable, then they'll pay you for it. And I think in England they have the treasure trove law, and I could be wrong, but from what my understanding of it is, the Crown owns anything below ground, even if it's private property, but I'm not.
Convenient.
Yeah, but what they'll do is, again, they'll give you they'll give you restitution if you find something. And so the positive takeaway is you're going to report it because you're going to get paid either way.
And it'll be properly preserved.
And it'll be properly preserved.
Yeah.
So also too, people kind of get suspicious if all of a sudden like a whole bunch of one thing just hits the market. And I think that's how they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. Somebody was selling the scrolls after they were found, and there was a British diplomat who's like, oh, wow, there's a whole bunch of this stuff coming up. And then he was able to contact trace it back to where it was located.
Interesting. So we're running a little bit here. I think we'd like to get some questions, but
Okay.
I wanted to make sure that we still covered.
No, I'm just good for questions.
Okay.
I'm just enjoying like talking about some of this stuff, and then.
No, it's been a fun conversation.
Well, there's two cool ways too. Like we'll do the questions, but like once we get opened, and people can start coming to the club again, I'm here every Thursday, and if anyone wants to hit me up on anything that they don't get answered today, we can do it then.
Okay, sounds good. So Andy.
Yes, Ken?
How are we doing? Do we have people in the wings with questions?
Question from the chat? Absolutely. Thank you so much, folks, for joining in and listening to the program. Just so you all know, I have an assistant back here with me tonight, Mr. David McAlexander,
Who?
on the buttons. So you can thank the smoothness of the cameras. Thank him for that. First question from the chat comes from Jay Foonberg. Jay wants to know, how would you distinguish archaeology, anthropology, and paleontology?
Okay, so archaeology is a study of material remains. And so archaeology, the root word is going to be archaic. And ology is Greek, it means a study of. So if you have, like the word biology, bio means life, ology is a study of. So biology is literally the study of life. And so anytime you see that ology at the end of any word, it's going to be the study of. And archaeologist, the IST ending, is Greek, which means specialist. So like even as something as simple as florist, floral, flower, IST is specialist. So that's the flower specialist. So archaeologist is you're studying actual artifacts that have been left behind in the record. Anthropology is a broader study. So archaeology is a subfield of anthropology. So you have anthropology, and now I got to go back to Dr. Morris and Dr. Sims in my intro anthropology classes way back in the day. And I'm kind of hitting teacher mode here, so I don't want to get too boring with it. But archaeology, or anthropology, you have linguistics is a field, archaeology is a field, osteology, the study of like human bones and remains. And then paleontology is something I didn't study, but I think that's like dinosaurs and dinosaur bones and relics and stuff, which is something I never got into.
So non-human
I
evolution.
think, and I might be wrong, so if somebody's got a better definition of that, I'm more than willing to listen. But for anthropology, that's just a study of peoples and cultures. You can be an anthropologist and go live with modern day people and study their cultures and how they do things, and that would fall under anthropology. So like, it could be as simple as the Inuit, or you might go live with a group of people in Canada who are like, you can study just regular people. I mean, my one professor, Dr. Morris, who was an awesome professor, he used to go to Smith's Food Kings, which is a restaurant, or which was a grocery store in Utah, and they had a snack bar, and all these guys would come in and get breakfast every morning. Well, he would go and hang out, and he's like, yeah, I'm studying the culture of rednecks in Cache Valley, which is cool because my family always ate there, so I'm like, cool, I'm being studied. My redneck culture is being preserved for other people. Does that answer Jay's question?
All right, thank you so much. Next question from the chat comes from David Hayen. It says, Brian, As a kid, me and my friends and I, he did good writing, he's a lawyer, used to collect old cigar boxes. Some were metal, others wooden, and the rest were cardboard. My wife asserts that I had the collector gene. What is it that attracts people to treasure hunting, do you think?
For me, it's, and I can only speak for myself, for me it's the chase, or it's the idea of finding something. Like that adrenaline rush of hitting the metal detector or digging and knowing something's there and not knowing what it is and then digging it up. It's almost like, it's kind of anticlimactic once you find something, but it's the adrenaline to find something, the thought of finding something that is so much fun. And I think the guy who said that best was the author Clive Cussler. He was writing about his main character, Dirk Pitt. And these are fantasy, men's adventure books from back in the day. But he wrote about Dirk Pitt once, and once Dirk found the Titanic, once he found the wreck of the Cyclops, once he found the Library of Alexandria, which was in Rome, Texas, by the way, if you're ever looking for it, it was always, he was done and he didn't think about what he'd found. He was on to the next idea of finding something. And I think it really is the chase. And it can be a lost city, or it could be as simple as just metal detecting, an old ghost town, or exploring an old mine shaft or whatever. It's the idea you might find something. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Bryan. Next comes from Chuck Jonke. Chuck wants to know, what are some of the California sites you'd like to study and maybe haven't had a chance to yet?
I don't really have anything in California that I'd like to study. I'll take that back. Federal land. So Fort Irwin is a training area here in California. It's like right outside of Barstow. And I should have told you guys this earlier, and I'm glad Chuck brought this up. Anytime you go onto a military base, it's a large base, you get a safety brief, and they tell you the rules and conduct. And every time we go to Irwin, they tell us if we find, unexploded ordnance, don't touch it. Don't mess with the desert tortoise, because if you pick it up, it's going to urinate and then dehydrate, and you'll get a fine. But they always tell us to beware of indigenous sites, because those training areas all have indigenous sites. And those training areas have been used forever. What I would be I got 20 years in the military, and I know how Joes lose stuff, and by Joes I mean soldiers. I would like to go, if I could do anything, I would definitely like to explore military sites for artifacts left behind by soldiers. Soldiers that trained to go to war under Patton that left stuff behind. Soldiers that trained for Vietnam, soldiers that trained for Korea. Because if one thing a soldier is going to do, he's going to lose stuff. And my personal feelings are every military base that's bigger than a city block is prime hunting ground for military artifacts. So that would be what I would really be interested in. By training, I'm a historian, and I am very much wedded in historical archaeology, and I really do like military history and military archaeology, so that's what I would like to do. If I could go on those bases and root around and look for those type of artifacts, I would definitely do it. Also, if I make a mistake, then I'm not going to destroy something vital in the cultural record. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, thank you so much. Next question is, do you still treasure hunt? And if so, what are some of your favorite spots to go?
Okay, so yes, I do treasure hunt. And I'm actually, my wife's going to be so pleased to know that I'm pricing metal detectors for this summer. But I do treasure hunt. Still the same thing. Ghost towns are kind of not on my list anymore. I'm more interested in finding the landowner and getting permission to hunt, and then anything I find, we can figure out how to split it, or if he wants it and I just get the adrenaline rush of finding it, I'm cool with that, because I think I was talking to you earlier, I have a house that's full of old stuff that I've dug up and brought home, and I don't think my wife is very interested in me accumulating more stuff. So I would do that, and I really am going to have a go at magnet fishing eventually, because that looks super cool. And there are all these like kids out there doing it on YouTube, so get on YouTube, type in magnet fishing, and be ready to go down the rabbit hole. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you so much. Final question of the night from the chat, or final question of the night from the chat is, hang on. If someone wanted to get into treasure hunting, what are some tools and like what are some kits that you can recommend for folks to get started with?
Okay, so first of all, I'm going to say treasure. I'm going to define treasure as anything that you find of value. And then my next thing is treasure is where you find it. So if you're interested in metal detecting, do the research and get a metal detector that you think is going to serve you. And the price point is from $70 for something that'll get you out and finding pop tabs and nails all the way up to several $1,000s. I prefer White's Electronics because that's what I got as a kid. And so I think anything by White's is good. By the same token, you can't go wrong with the Garrett metal detector. Bounty Hunter makes great metal detectors. Tessero makes great metal detectors. And then your price point, probably need to spend about $150 to $200 to get a really legit metal detector. And then as far as where to hunt, that's up to you and your imagination. Anywhere you think you're going to find something. A lot of people like to go to the beach because people go there every year and they lose stuff. Other people, if you're searching for relics, then you're going to get into more old homesteads and mines and things like that. And then I would be irresponsible if I said, be super careful. Like if you're rooting around old buildings and stuff, I mean, they can come down. It can be dangerous, but that's where the fun is. Oh, and I should also, one thing I did forget I mentioned with Ken, one of my cooler not metal detecting finds about treasure hunting, I was going through an old barn that was partially collapsed, and I found a big box of books, like that had been there forever, turn of the century type stuff. And a lot of them were Mormon history, which I obviously I found it in Utah, but I donated it to some of the books to Utah State University for their historic collection. But one of the books that I kept was an original 1912 version, The Wreck of the Titanic. So if we're talking about one of the coolest things I've ever found, that was the coolest thing I ever found. So that book, I was just like, oh my gosh, because it was published the same year the ship had wrecked, and it was a first edition printing. And it was at the bottom of the box, so it was in really good shape. Any other questions? Anything else?
Hey, actually, there is one more question from
Okay.
the chat, and it's actually it's actually a really good question from Ryan Jones. Would you be interested in doing archaeology in foreign battlegrounds? I think it would be I think it would be amazing to see how many artifacts from World War II could easily be dug up in areas like the Philippines.
Yeah, I would definitely be interested in doing that. And yeah, that would be legit as all get out. I mean, and the thing is, like with World War II, like stuff in the Philippines, you're 100% right. But again, if you get on YouTube, I mean, there are guys in Russia that are like finding tanks from World War II in rivers and stuff.
Yeah.
And machine guns and things like that, because there's just so much stuff. And with that, I would there's an archaeological component to that, but realistically, that's more where you're getting into relic hunting and treasure hunting. And there are people who could debate the merit of using legit archaeological procedures or just going out and digging up stuff with your metal detector. I kind of fall into the digging up stuff with your metal detector, and if you find something cool, shoot a GPS. And obviously, if you find human remains, report it, or you find dog tags. But yeah, I would do that in a heartbeat. That's actually one of the things I want to do as I sunset into retirement, is go overseas and do battlefield archaeology. And you can do it on your own, and they also have tours. So.
And you want to be very careful what you dig up.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of unexploded ordnance, but you got to risk it for the biscuit.
Yes.
So, I think like 40 to 60 people get killed a year from leftover ordnance from World War I and World War II. So as long as you're careful, and if it's worth blowing yourself up to dig up a cool find, go for it. I think it's worth it. I mean, I would totally do it. I don't care. I mean, because, God, could you imagine finding think about it, you dig up a World War II weapon, and that would just be awesome.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's like something that somebody held and used, and that was pivotal for their survival.
Yeah.
And just the idea of finding something like that is just it kind of blows me away to think about. That's a good question. Anybody else?
That's it for tonight. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in, and hope to see you next week for another great show.
All right. Well, a couple of things before we tune out. Bryan, first of all, thank you for a great program.
Okay.
Really enjoyed our talk.
Well, I had a lot of fun.
We're going to talk some more.
Oh, yeah.
Secondly, thank you very much for all the work that you've been doing to help bring the club back around during our closure. For those of you who don't know, we're looking at opening up again fairly soon. We don't have the exact time and date down, but we want to be able to bring people back to the club, and we've taken advantage of this year of shutdown to do a whole ton of renovation around the club and a lot of deep cleaning and bringing things up to speed and preserving the original feel of the club, but making it a lot better for everybody. So I hope you guys have a chance to come out and visit us soon and participate in these programs in person. Last thing is, you mentioned the Cache Valley and the Mountain Men. Next week, I believe our program is specifically on mountain men.
Oh.
And their coverage of those areas and how they were explored before anyone was out there. And it should be an interesting program. So, again, if you liked what you heard tonight, click that like button and click subscribe. And we'll bring you a whole lot more as we go along here. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Have a great evening. Come back next week.